Hello everybody, this is TipTopMTG here today with another Magic the Gathering video. In today's video, we are going to be talking about the August 3rd, 2020 Banned and Restricted announcement. This is probably one of the biggest Banned and Restricted announcements ever, and it really is going to change a lot of formats. So it's really important that we break this down and talk about the reasons for certain things. So in order, we have, in Standard, there are 4 bans. So we have Wilderness Reclamation, Growth Spiral, Teferi Time Raveler, and Cauldron Familiar. So all of these cards are banned. So this is as of today on MTG Arena. You will get wild cards for all of these. Then for Pioneer, we have Inverter of Truths, Kethis the Hidden Hand, Walking Ballista, and Underworld Breach. And then in Historic, we have Wilderness Reclamation. And then we also have Teferi. And then also in Brawl, we have Teferi. So Teferi is banned in 2 formats, suspended in 1. Wilderness Reclamation is banned in Standard, suspended in Historic. I don't see these cards ever being reintroduced, but it is technically possible. So why don't we break these down based on format? So let's switch back to Wilderness Reclamation and talk about their reasoning. So in the last Banned and Restricted list update, we chose not to make any changes to Standard. At that time, the environment had just seen the results of Player Tours 3 and 4, the new companion rules, the companion rules change was recent, and Core Set 2021 had just entered the format. While we saw new decks emerging, ultimately the top decks were able to adapt and retain their metagame share. After watching the environment progress for several weeks and reviewing the deck list entries for the Player Tours final, we have decided to make some changes to the metagame. So yes, there was a lot of criticism that in their last Banned and Restricted announcement they didn't touch Standard, so it's good that they are touching it and really actually shaking it up a lot. Wilderness Reclamation is the head of 2 really powerful decks right now in Standard, and without it, that deck doesn't exist. So those decks are just off. The most powerful deck is now just, gotten rid of. That'd be like if they took out Winota out of the Winota deck. It wouldn't work. This set of changes is a deviation from our usual ban list philosophy for Standard, and as such, we consider it an experiment. Outside of the very top levels of competitive play, including throughout most of MTG Arena's traditional Standard ladder, we're seeing a good distribution of deck diversity and win rates. However, at the skill level of our most competitive tournaments and the Mythic ranking on the Arena ladder, we do see a small number of decks with high win rates and play rates that have remained in that metagame position for quite some time. So basically, they're saying, a lot of the time we don't ban things because, it really only affects, just basically they're looking at Mythic rank, and especially because people are playing a lot more MTG Arena around now. So because of the whole pandemic, they are being a little bit more aggressive with bans is what it seems like, because people are playing at those higher power levels because MTG Arena is one of the only ways to play, and generally when you're playing MTG Arena, you're playing to win, which means you're playing at those high power levels. Under our usual approach, we would have allowed Standard rotation to provide a natural and predictable shift in the metagame with the release of Zendikar Rising, but in an era of social distancing, the proportion of Standard play occurring on digital platforms has increased substantially. As the rate which players can rack up games of Standard in digital is higher than in tabletop, we believe it's better to correct it. Basically, they're saying, in paper, maybe you play 3 matches, or 3 matches a week, but with MTG Arena, you could play 20 matches in a day. And so people are playing those more competitive and playing, for prizes more. So it's important that the metagame is healthier. Therefore, we're making bans targeted at weakening decks that have been strong and popular at the highest levels of competitive play, and at some cards and combos that have overstayed their welcome in the eyes of much of the Standard community. So we're going to talk about Growth Spiral. Growth Spiral, ramp decks using Growth Spiral together made up 68% of the day 1 metagame at Players Tour Finals and represented approximately 25 to 30% of the metagame at Mythic ranking on the Arena ladder. So yes, decks that like to ramp out with Growth Spiral. Honestly, if you're playing Simic, you're playing Growth Spiral. So yeah, it's good to see this card go a little bit earlier, even if, it's just good to see it go, even if it would have gone away in a little bit. It's not very healthy. Everything about it just feels wrong. The instant speed, the drawing card, I don't know. Something about the card isn't very fun to play against. Then they go on to say, within that category, Wilderness Reclamation decks have been considerably the strongest archetype by much of the competitive community, making up 54% of the metagame at the PT Finals and about 15% of the Mythic metagame on Arena. In order to remove Reclamation decks from this most played spot and reduce the metagame share of ramp decks, Wilderness Reclamation and Growth Spiral are banned. So they're basically saying, hey, ramp decks, these should be a massive hit. A lot of the decks can't exist anymore. Cool. Another archetype that maintained a high win rate overall over a long period is Black Red or Jund Sacrifice, featuring Cauldron Familiar and Witch's Oven. In addition to having high overall win rates, these decks put considerable pressure on aggressive and mid-range decks. Further, the number of triggers generated by these decks can be cumbersome for players in digital to play. So basically, it's really obnoxious. You have to sack the cat creates a token, then you have to sack the token, it resolves, it enters. So every time you do that, it's like 4 or 5 triggers that are happening, and that takes a really long time, and it seems like that's probably the number one reason why Cauldron Familiar was banned. Was it's annoying to play on digital, and everyone is playing on digital right now. So yeah, I think this is a good choice. It's the only card being banned in standard that isn't rotating out, so this one will have one of the biggest effects. Finally, we'll also be removing Teferi Time Raveler from the environment. We've often heard the feedback that the repetitive play patterns and reduced capability interaction that Teferi Time Raveler can create feels oppressive and limiting. While we'd considered banning Teferi, based on that feedback in past updates, one reason we didn't was evidence that it was holding Wilderness Reclamation decks in check. Yes, they can't do the whole expansion explosion thing if they can't cast spells at instant speed. So yes, that does kind of do something, but I think Teferi was too much of a problem on its own. They probably should have banned Wilderness Reclamation and Teferi a while ago. We note that Growth Spiral, Wilderness Reclamation, and Teferi Time Raveler were already slated to rotate with the release of Zendikar Rising. With that in mind, we view this set of changes as an early rotation for those cards to help freshen up the remaining summer metagame. In the case of Cauldron Familiar, we're taking the opportunity not only to improve the metagame short term, but also remove balance, risk, and undesirable play patterns leading into next year. We emphasize that these changes are, to a large degree, a product of the times and currently focus on digital play. Yeah, so basically a lot of these choices are here just because of digital, which I don't think is necessarily an awful thing. It's just, I think that paying attention to digital is important because right now that's what everyone's doing. I just don't know if, because Cauldron Familiar isn't rotating out, I don't know if it's fair to base the whole, the next year of metagames based on just, I don't want to say like a slight pandemic. Obviously, this is a huge issue, but this is a fact. It's banned now for digital play, but what about when digital play isn't at its prominent state that it is now? And that's kind of my question. Maybe they'll bring it back, but also I don't like the card, and the combo's kind of cheap too, so it'll be nice to see this get knocked down. So, yep. Next, we move into Pioneer. So I am much less versed in Pioneer, but let's go over what they have to say. With the last banned and restricted update, we chose to unban Oath of Nissa, which I know a lot of people were upset about. This wasn't intended to be a major update to the format or an alternative to other change, but rather what we viewed as a relatively safe unban in the context of a metagame that was looking healthy by many metrics. I don't exactly understand that. Yes, you can bring a card back, but if the metagame's looking quote-unquote healthy, why mess with it? Much community discussion followed that update, prompting us to take a further look at the need for change in Pioneer. Although we continue to see many different decks that have success and no deck with problematic win rates on the field, we do see combo decks as a big portion. Yes, there are, I believe, 3 or 4 huge combo decks right now that are just dominating, and a lot of people have been calling for them to be banned. Things include Kethis, which is getting banned, and the Heliod Walking Ballista combo. So really, every single card banned here was a combo card. So like, for instance, Inverter of Truth. These bans are primarily aimed at disrupting Inverter of Truth decks, Underworld Breach decks, the Heliod Sun Crowned plus Walking Ballista combo decks, and Kethis the Hidden Hand combo deck. So those are all combo decks. While Kethis combo are relatively new reemergence in the metagame, we're seeing signs that these decks already have problematic and would become more so if other top decks were weakened. Kethis decks are currently 5-0 trophy winners in Magic Online Pioneer leagues, and despite being a modest portion of the field. So basically, Kethis is too problematic, and if they were to say get rid of the Inverter of Truths combo and the Heliod combo, well then Kethis would be even more powerful. So they kind of have to ban it because they're banning everything else, which I think is fair. Therefore, we're choosing to ban Inverter of Truth, Underworld Breach, and, all of these cards that are kind of appearing on screen now. Those are all being banned. Our intent is to reduce the instances where players risk losing to a combo when tapping out in early to mid-game. This should open up a field for more traditional mid-range control and put less pressure on aggressive decks to also focus on hand disruption and counter spells. Yeah, essentially they're saying combo decks were working too early in the game, and what that was causing was that people were like they couldn't do their thing early game. They had to worry about, oh, turn 4, am I about to lose? Do I need to save a counterspell? Do I need to disrupt your hand and see what's about to happen? So that should reduce that, which I think is good. We did consider several other cards, such as alternate bans aimed at the same decks. Thassa's Oracle was one that we discussed as a slight lighter touch for weakening Inverter and Breach decks. Yeah, that would theoretically work because, I mean, there are other cards, Jace and Laboratory Maniac, but Thassa is obviously one of the better ones because you don't have to draw a card, you can just play it, and Jace is kind of expensive and hard to cast. So, however, the Inverter decks are still capable of winning with Jace and alone, and it isn't clear that a Thassa's Oracle ban would be enough to push Inverter decks out of the competitive metagame. I think it is. 2 mana versus 4, and you need an extra blue. I think it would definitely weaken it if you wanted to keep, because they say one thing, they want to weaken it, but then, they thought about, oh, maybe we should weaken it, but then they also said, oh, we want to push it out of the metagame. There's a difference. You can weaken something and leave it in the metagame. So they clearly meant to kick this out of the metagame, not just weaken it. Obviously, and that's why they got rid of Inverter. Next, even though Thassa's Oracle has been a win condition of choice for Underworld Breach decks, once the deck's core combo engine is running, it can win in many other ways. Some recent versions of Underworld Breach decks even forgo Thassa's Oracle entirely. The cards we've chosen gives us the most confidence, creating a significant shift in the metagame. So, if for those of you who weren't counting for Standard, essentially 3 to 4 decks, because Teferi really isn't a deck, unlike Cauldron Familiar and Wilderness Reclamation Growth Spiral. Well, Teferi kind of just goes in everything, so that first off is going to shift a bunch of things, but also I guess Teferi could be Azorius Control, but they're in Standard 3 to, I would say, 5 decks are all either being pushed down in power or just removed, and it looks like in Pioneer we have 4 different decks being removed. So yeah, expect massive shifts in the metagame of a lot of different things, and we haven't even gotten into something like Historic Brawl. So, yep, the cards we've chosen give them the most confidence. We understand that this represents a large change to the Pioneer environment, and frankly, that's the intent. So they're trying to change it for, a drastic amount. While we're past the phase of frequent weekly updates to Pioneer, we are still in a period where changes are necessary to help shape the format in its initial launch year. We want to ensure that Pioneer can deliver an enjoyable play experience to players who are looking for an accessible, non-rotating format that's closer to Standard and power level and offers a variety of archetypes and decks to choose from. We're dedicated to actively supporting Pioneer and continue to incorporate both data and community feedback. Okay, so basically what they're saying is they don't want what happened to Brawl to happen to Pioneer. What happened was, in Brawl, there was a card named Baral that was really problematic, and people wanted it gone, but they were too slow to act. And so with Pioneer, they said, okay, instead of, banning things ahead of time, we're just going to ban every week. And then for the first week, or for the first year, we're going to be a little bit more aggressive with bans and making the format more fun, because we don't want what happened to Brawl to happen to Pioneer, which I think is probably a good idea. Honestly, I don't hate aggressive banning. I know I'd rather have the non-problematic cards printed. Obviously, don't print the problematic cards. That's a better solution. But I think that if a card is problematic, ban it. There shouldn't be an argument against that. So, yeah. I think that that's overall good for Pioneer. So Standard and Pioneer are going to have massively different metagames. What you should really look for in those formats are the other decks that didn't get affected. What was the most powerful deck that wasn't touched? That's highly likely to be the most competitive deck, but that's not always true. Maybe there was a card in some of the most popular decks that just shut down something else. So let's say, I don't know, mill decks in Pioneer, you wouldn't run one because, well, they're already trying to mill themselves, so that's not going to help much. But maybe now those rise up. I'm not saying they are, but I'm just saying that's an example of something where maybe it's not in the metagame now, but the lack of, the whole breach deck is gone. So yeah, I think that is pretty awesome. Next, let's move into Historic. So The historic metagame is moving quickly right now with the addition of cards through Jumpstart and next week the addition of Amonkhet Remastered. There are many new decks that we are watching closely, but our strong preference in times like this is to give the meta time to develop naturally. Yes, this is true. Jumpstart came out last month, and even if there is a deck, like let's say Goblins, that's considered problematic, which I don't think it's super problematic, I just think the metagame has to kind of shift around it. Amonkhet Remastered is going to change everything again. That said, there are two places where we feel we have enough information that we should take action: Wilderness Reclamation and Teferi Time Raveler. We touched on Wilderness Reclamation in our last banned and restricted list update, saying that while it was powerful, we were really only seeing it in problematic decks alongside Nexus of Fate. Since then, it's become more like Standard, and now they use Expansion Explosion, but unlike Standard, we have Field of the Dead. We are seeing this deck put up significant numbers representing over 10% of best of 3 games, while maintaining concerning win rates. This is a deck that we feel has spent a good amount of time. They've been discussing it, analyzing it, and watching it, so we feel that there's enough evidence to show that they should ban it. I agree. I also think that this is kind of one of the signs that show Standard and Historic are still a little too close. Yes, we have Jumpstart, yes, we have the Historic Anthologies, and yes, we have 4 sets, but right now that's not enough difference to have differences in Standard decks. I mean, Jumpstart was the first big, this feels like a more powerful format, this feels like a different format, but this is, if you took a strong Standard deck, you could just play it in Historic without any changes, and obviously if you changed it, it would be even better. So I think that getting rid of some of the similarity, although now Wilderness Reclamation is banned, or this one's suspended in both, I just think that this is a good move. For Teferi Time Raveler, we get much of the same feedback in Historic of Standard. I'm going to summarize this. Basically, same reason, they just know that Teferi's annoying to play against. And I agree, Historic didn't have the whole, oh, it's rotating out in 2 months, woo. It was, no, it's gone. So, yeah, that's Historic. And then Brawl, they basically say, hey, it's one of the highest winning decks. It appears too often, and it's annoying. So, same reason as the other 2 formats. So bye-bye Teferi. So then they talk about the date, or the timing. For instance, they didn't announce this one ahead of time like they have almost every single other one, and they basically say, because everyone's playing digitally, we really don't feel it's necessary to tell you ahead of time. Essentially, they don't want you to go craft a bunch of cards on MTG Arena hoping they get banned so that you get the wild cards back, and just basically they don't want to the reason they say is that they don't want to wait. Basically, if they were, and I kind of agree, if they were to do the 1 week's notice, what seems like it would have happened is that this ban announcement would come next week instead of this week, and they want to get this out as soon as possible so it's not as close to rotation. Alright guys, so that's it for today's news about the banned and restricted announcement. So it looks like we had 11 bannings, which is one of the biggest I've ever seen. If you enjoyed this video and found it useful, please hit that like button. If you want to see more awesome content like this, please hit the subscribe button, and let me know what you guys think about all this in the comments down below. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.